It is finally time to talk about the fifth song from Bob Dylan's Rough and Rowdy Ways album. That song is Black Rider. This is a very simple song on the surface, both lyrically and musically, but that, not surprisingly, turns out to be untrue. I, of course, like to concentrate on the lyrics, but the seemingly very sparse, almost non existent music has been cited as qualifying this number as Dylan's, quote, most complex song ever. Check out Eolf Ostrom's website, Things Twice, for a detailed breakdown on why. He spends 2,200 words on the first verse alone, again, concentrating on the music. But as that essay correctly points out, you wouldn't notice, and certainly not with an untrained ear. But let's pivot to what I like to focus on, the words, because I'm a writer, and that's just what I most admire about Dylan. He has 295 of them in this song, 30 lines spread evenly across 5 stanzas, each of them having exactly 6 lines. In the song, Dylan consistently talks to, never with, the Black Rider, and as you can guess, everybody is wondering who is the Black Rider. Dylan being Dylan, I doubt there's a simple answer, but candidates include his own mortality, not just one, but 2 of the Horsemen of the Apocalypse, we'll get into that later, Bob Dylan's public persona, Satan, you name it. Now, Dylan was, of course, steeped in the mythology of the Wild West because of the generation he was in when he was a kid, so I love that there's a fictional character, Black Rider, who's masked. So the perennial question around him was obviously, who is the Black Rider? And he seems like kind of a Lone Ranger knockoff, and Dylan, of course, sang about the Lone Ranger, and the Lone Ranger, black mask, and a rider. There might be something there as well. I mean, the start of the song does sound vaguely spaghetti westernish. See what I mean? And, boy, a lot of ink has been spilled about this song. There's been a lot of articles on it, which is really surprising. It's in the middle of the album, it's the shortest song on the album, but I don't think anyone else has pointed out this potential Western influence, which is as strong a possibility as any. This is not a scene from Western, this is a scene from the play Black Rider, a collaboration from theater director Robert Wilson, writer William S. Burroughs, yes, that William S. Burroughs, and Tom Waits. And if you didn't know that that thing existed, like I didn't until I researched this song, you're welcome. You can find the whole thing on YouTube with English subtitles. There's a lot to say about it. It's based on German folklore. It seems to relate to the real-life incident where William Burroughs shot his wife to death in a bar full of people in Mexico, and the music by Tom Waits is of course fantastic. However, let's keep to our purpose here. Was this in Dylan's mind at all? Well, he certainly knows of Tom Waits. They're kindred spirits, they've corresponded, they've probably met, and Dylan has no doubt read plenty of William Burroughs. It's kind of impossible that he wouldn't know about this play, but I'll tell you, if you read about the play, watch the whole thing, which was all well worthwhile doing on its own anyway, and then look at the lyrics from the song, you're not going to find much. On a similar note, if you read Stephen Crane's very long poem, Black Riders and Other Lines, you also won't find much. And of course, it is equally as rewarding as watching The Black Rider. And it's equally as likely that Dylan is familiar with this work as well. Again, almost impossible that he's not.
Black Rider, you been living too hard. Been up all night, have to stay on your guard.
Just the opening couplet for you there, so you could hear some of that intimate singing that I was talking about. Let's speak through the lyrics at least a little bit. That's usually what I spend all my time doing, but the Black Rider mystery is just so fun, and there's so much more to go on that. Anyway, the path that you're walking is too narrow to walk. If that path is narrow enough, I guess it'd be like a line, and that of course made me think of Johnny Cash and the line that he walked, and the fact that he was the man in black. See how easy it is to keep going back to thinking about who the Black Rider could be? Regardless, every step of the way another stumbling block. That reminds me of Stephen Crane's A Man Toiled on a Burning Road, Never Resting, from the referenced poem. The road that you're on, same road that you know, but it's not the same as it was a minute ago. Kind of reminds me of Heraclitus, never stepping into the same river twice. Black Rider, you've seen it all. You've seen the great world, and you've seen the small. You fell into the fire, and you're eating the flame. Better seal up your lips if you want to stay in the game. Let's talk about that second couplet. Well, I'll be damned, but we're back to Johnny Cash and Stephen Crane. You fell into the fire. I fell into a burning ring of fire, right, obviously. And then Stephen Crane, in, of course, his poem Black Riders, or is the truth bitter as eaten fire? The second half of the couplet continues the eating fire theme in a way, if you know what to look for, because it's an obvious reference to the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah has his lips sealed with burning coal by an angel, who tells him, "Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged." I just love how Dylan does this kind of thing. Like, to me, I'm just guessing he doesn't care if you're too lazy to do the work and ever figure out that couplet, but it's there. Fire is the common element in both of those lines, right? Burning and fire, and it all makes sense once you know that, but he's not going to make it that easy for you. And I think even a great songwriter, another great songwriter, would have a word like fire or whatever in the second line. It would be way more on the nose. Anyway, this one little couplet, 2 lines, you have this arc of redemption, right? Sin and redemption. Fell into the fire, obvious reference to going to hell, as a possibility, but then fire is used to purge Isaiah's sins, so sin and repentance. And all of that is just about 2 lines, right? 1 couplet. You know how many couplets are in this song? 15. And you can see why I have to cherry pick my way through these songs and only focus on certain bits. Black rider, all dressed in black. I'm walking away and you try to make me look back. Well, another pretty obvious biblical reference there with Lot's wife looking back at Sodom and Gomorrah. So a continuation of the theme of sin, and meanwhile, all dressed in black, yep, makes me think of Johnny Cash again. Dylan pleads with the Black Rider more than once at the end of the last stanza. Be reasonable, mister, be honest, be fair, right? And then here in this stanza that we're on now, go home to your wife, stop visiting mine, one of these days I'll forget to be kind. A lot of people have taken note of that couplet, as you can imagine. A couple of notes on the song structure overall. We talked about some of that, but notice every stanza always begins by addressing the Black Rider directly. Black Rider, all dressed in black. Or Black Rider, tell me when, tell me how. Also, the rhyme scheme is as simple as it gets. It's a succession of pairs, AA, BB, CC. And, in typical workman-like fashion, Dylan, he puts in the work, right? The extra effort. Every pair uses a different sound, so you never have a lazy recycling. You do have one recycling, so the exception is, and you should know this by now if you've listened to my other videos, the start of the very last stanza. It's the first time you hear an old sound. He therefore subtly lets you know that the song is about to end, despite the very rigid structure that we talked about. In a normal song, the bridge would come in and it'd be painfully obvious that the song was wrapping up. Anyway, Black Rider, tell me when, tell me how. If ever there was a time, then let it be now. Let me go through, open the door. My soul is distressed, my mind is at war. Wonderful lines that sound more like something from a great 18th, 19th century poem than from a 21st century song, right? And, there's been so much talk about, is this song about Dylan's own mortality? That part there certainly might be, if ever there was a time, let it be now. He wants to know something, tell me, open the door. Dylan knows that the end is not that far away in the trajectory of his life overall, sadly. This could be about that, but it's such an easy, almost lazy thing to interpret without some kind of concrete clue. Seems to me like with the Isaiah reference, that he gives you the key to unlock the meaning of a certain part of the song, if that's what he wants. And that brings us to the question about death, right? Is the Black Rider death personified? Well, he's not the Grim Reaper, because the Grim Reaper does not ride a horse, and Dylan's very precise with his language. This is a rider. This is somebody who rides a horse, presumably a horse, maybe a motorcycle, the modern equivalent of a horse. And here's Dylan as a Black Rider of sorts, and we know that he loves motorcycles. We talked about how important the mythos of the Wild West was to Dylan because of the time and place of his birth. Well, same thing with motorcycles and Black Riders, meaning black-jacketed, he's wearing a vest here, but you know what I'm saying, black-jacketed motorcycle riders. How iconic were Marlon Brando, pictured here with a Triumph motorcycle, no less, right? Dylan's preferred brand from the 60s. James Dean and others wearing black jackets, riding motorcycles, and I don't think I've seen anybody mention this possibility when they read about this song. I mean, Black Rider. This is one of the archetypes, in a way, of that phrase, and it's as much of a possibility as anything. It might even be more of a possibility than death, because, like we said, death can't be, in this song, the Grim Reaper, and that's what's forced people to say, well, it's maybe, and sometimes, of course, they'll state it as if it's a fact, that it's one of the 2 horsemen of the apocalypse, or one of 2, because you have death, of course, as one of the 4 horsemen, but he's specifically described as being on a pale horse, and the word black doesn't appear at all, which Dylan would be acutely aware of in describing him or the horse, so that's what's forced other people to say, well, that's why this would be the famine rider. And that's interesting. I don't think it's really likely, but, this is a merchant riding a horse with scales, And some people say this could be about, income inequality and scant resources. Does that seem likely to you? It doesn't to me. There's just no other hooks in the song reinforcing that message, I don't think. To me, this is all based on the fact that St. John does describe famine as riding a black horse specifically. Meanwhile, the rider himself is not described at all in terms of color. So anyway, moving on. We're on the penultimate stanza, by the way, and picking up from where I last quoted, it ends, "Don't hug me, don't flatter me, don't turn on the charm. I'll take out a sword and have to hack off your arm." And improbably, Monty Python makes it into our analysis, because King Arthur hacks off the Black Knight's arm in this scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's funny because King Arthur did not want to fight the Black Knight, but now will and does this. Dylan earlier in the song did not want to fight the Black Rider, if you remember, but now he's talking about doing this to him. And, let's talk about a Black Knight. Well, what is a knight's defining characteristic? The fact that he has a horse, right? That's why it's cavalier in French, caballero in Spanish. You can't be a knight, really, without a horse. A Black Knight, then, is a Black Rider by definition. And I'm not arguing so much that Dylan actually took inspiration from this, although you never know with him, but it's more about how the phrase Black Rider, the more you think about it, the more fairly obvious applications there are. I'm talking about fairly archetypal things, like a Black Knight, or, the rebel without a cause on a motorcycle, or the Wild West angle. I mean, how many movies did Dylan see growing up where there was a figure dressed in black riding on a horse? Now, Dylan has possibly fun with all of this because his Black Rider, by the way, is walking, at least in the start of the song. He says that specifically. And this composite image of James Dean and Bob Dylan both on motorcycles that you're looking at is my reminder to get to my central thesis, which is that the song is not about, as far as trying to understand it or unlock the mystery, it's not about what one thing is the Black Rider, but what kind of a composite is it? Because that seems to me a much more likely origin for the song. I think the conceit of the song is something like that, and that's what got Dylan going, not, I'm going to write a song about my impending death and all personified as a quote-unquote Black Rider. Speaking of a Black Rider, yet again, here's Dylan riding his chrome horse, sans diplomat, around the time of his infamous accident. So kind of interesting. Could he have been thinking about that point in his biography at all? He could have found his death on that ride. Well, you can just keep having fun with this question because right now we're looking at an image from the old animated version of Lord of the Rings, and we're looking at a Nazgul, or Black Rider, as they were specifically described. And Dylan, of course, well, possibly made a Lord of the Rings reference one time when he talked about Misty Mountains in a song. And those books were all the rage among his ilk at the time, the 60s, when he wrote A Hard Rain's A Gonna Fall. Anyway, there's a possible joke in all of this as well. It's going to take us back to the Tom Waits-William Burroughs collaboration, because in the play Black Rider, there is no Black Rider, which I thought was odd. I kept waiting for some character to show up on horseback, so to speak, and it never happens. So that reminds me of how in this song, remember at the start, our rider is actually walking. As far as the play and its plot, that makes sense though, because one of the definitions of the word rider is a proviso, or contractual fine print. Interesting. Always with Dylan, think about the alternate definitions of words he uses, but I'm just going to leave that there. We need to get to the last stanza, don't we? And the very notable couplet, the most notable in the entire song, which escaped nobody's notice. Black Rider, hold it right there. The size of your cock will get you nowhere. How about that? And that is actually a play on an ancient Roman satirical poem, and it's by Juvenal. How perfect is that name, by the way, given how juvenile the joke is. And speaking of juvenile jokes, Dylan's not above that. Black Rider, hold it right there, which means, hey, stop, of course, hold it right there. But then he talks about the guy's you-know-what, so hold it. Get it? I haven't seen anybody else notice that, although people do, of course, notice the ancient Roman reference. That's really where the analysis of this couplet stops, but I'm going to go way further, cast another line into the water, and see if what comes back makes any sense or not, because we now have a phallic reference in the song, obviously. And so tons of people have taken notice, oh wow, look at that. Okay, in the Dild song. Very notable, but that's it? Well, what you wouldn't know, what isn't obvious, unless you obsessively, possibly psychotically research these things, is that there was a character from Western lore and dime novels and all that called Deadwood Dick, or also known as the Prince of the Road, also known as you can see there, drumroll, the Black Rider. How about that? And he's the Black Rider of the Black Hills, which of course brings up the Dakotas. You probably know about Deadwood, South Dakota, from the show or the movie, and it turns out there's actually been more than one Deadwood Dick in Wild West, South Dakota lore, and one of them, this one here, was literally a black rider, a black cowboy. You're looking at real-life former slave turned legendary cowboy Nat Love, aka Deadwood Dick. Dylan, well steeped in Western lore, as he is, could he have had this black rider on his mind? Could he be a part of the composite that we talked about earlier? Both possibilities at least, right? His songs do, by intention or not, contain multitudes. And if all this sounds just inconceivable, it's not. I mean, we do know for a fact that sometimes Dylan embeds a puzzle, deeply into the song and includes a red herring for people to follow. The perfect example of this is his song Jolene, which everybody took to be a riff on Dolly Parton's iconic Jolene, and of course it turns out that wasn't the case at all. Total red herring, threw everyone off the mark, and it was actually a song about a much more obscure musical artist. Let's touch on the last couplet quickly. Some enchanted evening, I'll sing you a song. Black Rider, you've been on the job too long. Now, the most notable thing about that is the least noticed. That is that it forms a perfect bookend with the start of the song, so it really wraps things up. At the start, Black Rider, you've been living too hard. You've been up all night, having to stay on your guard. So there's the return of the you've been at this long enough note. First line of this final couplet, though, let's get back to that. Some enchanted evening, I'll sing you a song. Well, everybody's happy to point out the Rodgers and Hammerstein reference there. Some enchanted evening, American Songbook, even a song Dylan recently recorded in his albums of standards. But only here, I'll wager, are you gonna hear about Blue Oyster Cult's late 70s album called Some Enchanted Evening, the cover of which we're looking at, and yes, it's the Reaper as a black rider on a black horse. And sorry, but now I can't help but point out that their most famous song of all time, which does appear on this album, a live album, is Don't Fear the Reaper. Let's not forget the following and final line, though. Black Rider, you've been on the job too long. I agree with those who say that must be a reference to the song Duncan and Brady. That's right in Dylan's wheelhouse, without a doubt. I've actually heard him play the song live, in fact, and start a show with it. The original blues standard was an African-American murder ballad relating to events from a saloon in 1890. Dylan then does choose, consciously I would think, to end the song with a note about murder and not just that, but time expiring, been on the job too long. When I saw him do this song live, he changes it up a lot over the original, or any of the originals, the old versions, and been on the job too long is sung a lot. Dylan turns that line into the refrain, and if you look at, for instance, the Leadbelly version of the song, one of the seminal ones, probably the first one Dylan ever heard, it's not used that way at all. So that's what stands out to him. I think it's very purposeful, then, that he ends this song with a reference to it. In other words, I do think the song is about mortality in a lot of ways, and his, but I think he, if anyone, is the writer. It's not death. Patrolman or Sheriff Brady was killed, according to song and lore, because he'd been on the job too long. Dylan's been on this job a long time, luckily for us, and I think that, like Patrolman Brady, he sees himself dying doing this job. In other words, he's not going to stop. Thankfully for us. Black Rider, a song whose name and most common phrase is especially open to interpretation. Here's a final image that pulls in a lot of what I talked about. Death, Black Rider, Deadwood Dick, the Wild West. A lawman of sorts getting shot at. Lots of intriguing possibilities, very few certainties. Thanks.